Her heart's takeover, the female CEO's arranged marriage changed into a passionate love story. Hello, my dear YouTube family. I hope that wherever you are happy and doing well. My heartfelt wish is that your faces always shine with smiles and that your lives are filled with endless joy. Reading your wonderful comments filled my heart with gratitude. It makes me so happy to know that I have such true and supportive fans. Your love and positivity are truly an honor for me. And here's something special. In my next story, I will include the names and comments of my top fans because you all are a part of my journey. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your endless love. I am here only because of you, so keep showing your support and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's beautiful and heart-touching arranged marriage to love story. This isn't just a story, it's a journey of emotions that will surely touch your soul. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments about how you like today's story. So, let's begin. Ava Sterling had spent years building her empire, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and any semblance of a personal life to prove herself as the rightful head of Sterling Enterprises. She was sharp, strategic, and respected in the corporate world. Yet none of that mattered when her grandfather Theodore Sterling issued his ultimatum: marry within a month or lose control of the company she had poured her soul into. It was a crushing blow, not because Ava feared marriage itself, but because she knew exactly what it entailed in their world. The men from elite families would see her as nothing more than an acquisition, a trophy to be displayed rather than an equal partner. She had worked too hard to become a mere accessory to someone else's success. If she had to marry, she would do it on her terms. That was when she made a decision that left everyone stunned. She would marry not a businessman, not a socialite, but an ordinary employee from her company, someone who had no interest in power or wealth, and that someone was Lucas Hayes. She had noticed him before, not for the usual reasons, but because of his unwavering work ethic, his humility, and his quiet presence. Unlike the men who constantly tried to impress her with flashy cars and tailored suits, Lucas was different. He kept to himself, worked late nights without complaint, and never once looked at her with greed or ambition in his eyes. He was exactly the kind of man she needed, one who wouldn't try to control her or interfere with her business. Ava wasted no time. She had her assistant summon Lucas to her office, and when he arrived, she saw the confusion in his hazel eyes as he stood before her, clearly unsure why the CEO of the company had personally called for him. "Miss Sterling," he greeted, his voice polite but wary. Ava leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze head on. "I need a husband." The words hung in the air between them, and Lucas blinked as if he had misheard. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You heard me," Ava said calmly. "I need to get married within the next month or I lose my company. I've chosen you." Lucas's jaw tightened. Of all the scenarios he had imagined when he was called to the CEO's office, this was nowhere on the list. He was just an IT specialist, barely scraping by to pay for his mother's medical bills. The idea that someone like Ava Sterling, a woman who exuded power and confidence, would choose him for marriage was incomprehensible. "You don't even know me," he said cautiously. "I know enough," she countered. "You're hard-working. You keep to yourself. You don't seem like the kind of man who would use this marriage for personal gain." Lucas clenched his fists at his sides. He had never been the kind of man to take handouts, and this felt dangerously close to one. But then reality crashed down on him. His mother was sick, and the medical bills were drowning him. No matter how hard he worked, he was losing the battle. If this marriage could provide security for his mother, did he really have the luxury of saying no? He swallowed hard. "What exactly do you want from this arrangement?" Ava's expression remained unreadable. "It's simple. We get married, it remains strictly business, and in return, you'll be well compensated." Lucas hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. "And when the contract ends?" "We part ways," Ava said smoothly. "No complications." It should have been an easy decision. She was offering him financial security, a way to keep his mother alive. But there was something about this woman, something that made him wary. Still, he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll do it." Ava nodded, as if she had never expected a different answer. "The wedding is in 2 weeks." And just like that, Lucas found himself agreeing to an arranged marriage with the most powerful woman he had ever met. He told himself it was just a contract, that it wouldn't mean anything. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that nothing about this marriage was going to be as simple as Ava claimed. The wedding day arrived faster than Lucas could have anticipated, and he found himself standing in a grand ballroom, wearing a tailored black tuxedo that felt foreign against his skin. The ceremony was an extravagant affair, not because of love, but because Theodore Sterling insisted on keeping up appearances. Lucas felt out of place among the guests, all of whom were from the upper echelons of society, their eyes filled with curiosity about the unknown groom. He ignored the whispers, his fingers clenching as he waited at the altar. Then the doors opened, and everything else faded. Ava walked in. For the first time since their deal, Lucas felt his breath hitch. She was breathtaking in a flowing ivory gown, her dark hair cascading in soft waves, her striking green eyes locked onto his. He had known she was beautiful, but seeing her like this, walking toward him with an unreadable expression, did something to him he wasn't prepared for. Their eyes met, and something flickered between them, something neither of them could name. This was supposed to be just business, just a contract. But as Ava reached his side, as he slid the ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. This marriage was supposed to mean nothing, and yet as the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas couldn't ignore the way his heart pounded when Ava's hand brushed against his. He had agreed to this marriage to save his mother. He hadn't realized he might be risking something else entirely, his heart. Moving into the penthouse after the wedding felt surreal for Lucas. Just days ago, he had been living in a small, modest apartment, working late nights to make ends meet. Now, he was stepping into a world of wealth and luxury that felt almost foreign. The penthouse was a stunning masterpiece of modern design, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, polished marble floors that gleamed under soft golden lights, and a sprawling open space that seemed almost too large for 2 people. It was the kind of home most people dreamed of, but for Lucas, it was nothing more than a reminder of how out of place he was in Ava's world. The silence between them was thick as they entered the space together. Ava, always poised and unreadable, walked in without hesitation, as if she had lived there her whole life. Lucas, on the other hand, felt like an intruder. His rough hands hesitated before touching anything, afraid that one wrong move would shatter something expensive. The weight of reality settled on him. He was now living with his boss, a woman he had admired from afar, but never truly known. They were strangers, bound by a contract, sharing a home yet separated by an invisible wall neither of them knew how to break. Ava barely acknowledged him as she walked toward the bedroom area, setting down her handbag with practiced ease. "Your room is down the hall," she said smoothly, her tone businesslike. "Everything you need has been arranged." Lucas nodded stiffly, gripping the handle of his duffel bag. He had brought so little with him, just a few changes of clothes, his laptop and the essentials. Compared to the grandness of this place, his belongings felt insignificant. He walked down the hall, finding his room exactly as she described, minimalistic yet luxurious, with a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, and a closet far too big for the few items he owned. He sighed, dropping his bag onto the bed before running a hand through his hair. This was his life now, at least for the foreseeable future. Married to a woman who barely looked at him, living in a home that didn't feel like his, and pretending that this was all normal. Days passed in an uncomfortable rhythm. They saw each other at breakfast but barely spoke. Ava would leave early for work, her schedule packed with meetings, while Lucas worked remotely on IT projects, unsure of what to do with his free time. He wasn't used to this level of luxury, this level of nothingness. He had always been busy, always struggling, always pushing forward. Now he had everything he needed, yet he felt lost. But what surprised him the most was Ava. She wasn't the cold, arrogant CEO he had imagined. She didn't treat him like he was beneath her. In fact, she treated him with the same level of respect she gave everyone, formal, polite, but not unkind. When they did talk, it was brief, practical, about groceries, house arrangements, work schedules. There was no warmth, no real connection, just two people coexisting under the same roof. One evening, as Lucas was working on his laptop in the living room, he heard Ava's voice on a call. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her office door was slightly open, and her tone carried a sharp edge he had never heard before. "I don't care what they think," she snapped. "This is my company, and I will handle it my way." A pause, then a sigh. "No, grandfather. I'm not going to let you dictate my life any more than you already have." Lucas frowned, realizing she was arguing with Theodore Sterling. He had assumed Ava was a woman who had it all, power, wealth, control. But in that moment, he saw something else. She was fighting to keep what she had built. She was standing alone against expectations that tried to suffocate her. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of understanding. Later that night, as they sat at the dining table, Lucas did something unexpected. "Rough day?" he asked, breaking the silence. Ava looked up, momentarily surprised. She rarely shared personal matters, especially not with him, but something in his gaze was different. He wasn't prying, wasn't judging, he was just there. She sighed, setting down her fork. "It's always a rough day," she admitted. "Being a woman in this industry means fighting twice as hard for half the respect." Lucas nodded, understanding struggles in his own way. "You built something incredible," he said, his voice steady. "They can't take that from you." It was a simple statement, but it held weight. Ava studied him for a moment. Then, for the first time since their marriage, she offered him a small, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first crack in the walls between them. As days turned into weeks, Lucas found himself watching Ava more closely. She wasn't just the powerful CEO he had admired from afar. She was a woman who carried the weight of expectations, who fought battles he had never imagined, who worked late into the night just to prove she belonged. And Ava, despite herself, started noticing Lucas too. He wasn't just the quiet IT employee anymore. He was a man who listened, who didn't judge, who saw her not as a CEO, not as a Sterling, but as Ava. And somehow, in the vast emptiness of their penthouse, in the cold arrangement of their marriage, something unspoken began to shift between them. Lucas had always assumed that people with immense power and wealth lived lives of excess, lavish parties, expensive tastes, and a sense of superiority that came with their status. He had seen it before in the upper management of Sterling Enterprises, men and women who flaunted their riches without a second thought. So, when he married Ava, he expected the same. After all, she was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, a woman who commanded boardrooms and dominated business meetings. But every day spent in their shared home made him question those assumptions. Ava was different. She didn't drape herself in diamonds or demand attention. Instead, she was quiet in her strength, humble in a way he never expected. It started with the weekends. Lucas had anticipated that Ava would spend her free time at extravagant social events, rubbing shoulders with elite investors and high-profile executives. Instead, he discovered her slipping out of the penthouse early in the morning, dressed in casual clothes, a simple ponytail replacing the sleek hairstyles she wore to work. Curiosity got the best of him one Saturday, and he followed her discreetly. What he found left him speechless. She wasn't at a high-class brunch or a luxury spa. She was at an orphanage on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by children who clung to her as if she were their world. He watched from a distance as she knelt beside a little girl, helping her with homework, her laughter soft and genuine. It was a side of Ava he had never seen before, one that had nothing to do with power or wealth, but everything to do with kindness. Lucas found himself watching her more closely after that. At home, she was different from the CEO he saw at the office. Gone were the designer suits and the authoritative tone. Instead, she wore comfortable loungewear, her feet bare against the marble floors. She made her own coffee, despite having a state-of-the-art espresso machine. She read books late into the night, curled up on the couch, her face softened by the glow of a dim lamp. She never demanded luxury, never sought validation through expensive things. In fact, he realized she had never once flaunted her wealth. The grand penthouse, the private driver, the expensive art on the walls. None of it seemed to matter to her. She lived simply, as if the power she held in the corporate world was something separate from the person she truly was. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lucas walked into the living room to find Ava fast asleep on the couch. A thick file of documents lay open beside her, her laptop still glowing faintly. She had fallen asleep in the middle of reviewing reports, her head resting against a pillow, her breathing soft and even. Lucas hesitated, unsure whether to wake her. He had seen her exhaustion before, the way she poured herself into her work, fighting to keep the empire she had built. But seeing her like this, vulnerable and unguarded, did something strange to him. Without thinking, he stepped closer. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. As he carried her to her bedroom, a strand of hair fell across her face. He shifted slightly, brushing it away with a tenderness that startled him. This woman, his wife, but a stranger just weeks ago, was nothing like he had imagined. She was strong, yet gentle, powerful, yet kind. And for the first time since their marriage, a thought settled into his mind, one that refused to leave. Was this really just a contract? Or was something deeper beginning to take root in his heart? The storm raged outside, turning the city skyline into a blur of water-streaked lights. The wind howled against the glass windows of the penthouse, rattling them with an eerie persistence. Thunder cracked through the sky like a whip, followed by a brilliant flash of lightning that briefly illuminated the darkened space. The sudden power outage had left the entire penthouse in shadows, plunging the modern, luxurious space into an unfamiliar kind of silence, one that felt heavier than usual. Lucas had been in the kitchen, searching for a bottle of water, when the lights flickered and died. He wasn't worried about the darkness. Years of struggling through life had taught him not to fear things he couldn't control. But when he turned toward the living room, he noticed something unexpected. Ava, curled up on the couch, her posture stiff, her fingers digging into the fabric of a throw pillow. She wasn't her usual composed self, the woman who commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence, the CEO who never let emotions cloud her decisions, looked small in the dim light cast by the occasional flashes of lightning. Lucas watched her for a moment, debating whether or not to say something. Another deep roll of thunder shook the air, and she flinched ever so slightly. That was when he realized she was afraid. That realization unsettled him. He had never seen Ava show fear, not once since their marriage. She was always in control, always standing tall. But now, in the face of a raging storm, she looked vulnerable. It was such an unfamiliar sight that Lucas found himself moving before he could think twice about it. He walked toward the couch, his footsteps soft against the floor. Ava didn't look up, too focused on the storm outside. Without a word, he sat down beside her. Not too close, just enough so that she would feel his presence. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. The scent of her subtle vanilla perfume lingered in the space between them, mixing with the faint scent of rain drifting through the slightly open balcony door. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice softer than usual. Ava exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. "I'm fine," she said. But the tightness in her voice told a different story. Lucas glanced at her hands, still gripping the pillow tightly. Another sharp crack of thunder echoed through the room, and this time she squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment. It was instinctive, the way her body tensed, the way her fingers trembled just slightly. "You don't like storms," he stated rather than asked. Ava sighed, finally turning her head toward him. In the dim light, he could see the flicker of unease in her usually steady gaze. "I never have," she admitted. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a simple truth. But something about hearing her admit that made Lucas's chest tighten. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside continued its chaotic symphony, but the space between them remained still. Then, suddenly, a flash of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the penthouse in a bright, almost unnatural glow. Without thinking, without hesitation, Ava reached out and grabbed his hand. Lucas froze. Her fingers curled around his tightly, as if seeking something solid, something safe. Her grip was firm, yet he could feel the subtle tremble in her touch. It was a reflex, something she had done without thinking. His heart pounded against his ribs. Caught off guard by the sudden contact, he wasn't sure if it was the shock of her touch or the fact that she hadn't immediately pulled away. He didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, he let his thumb brush over her knuckles gently, a slow, reassuring motion. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice steady. Ava didn't look at him, but she didn't let go either. For the first time since the storm began, she seemed to breathe a little easier. Her shoulders, which had been tense, slowly relaxed. The warmth of her hand seeped into his skin, and Lucas found himself unwilling to break the contact. It was such a simple thing, a hand in another's, but it felt like more. It felt like a shift, like something in their carefully drawn boundaries had blurred. Minutes passed, though neither of them kept track of time. The storm outside was relentless, but inside, within this darkened penthouse, there was a quietness that neither of them had expected. Lucas risked a glance at her, and in the dim light, he saw her looking back at him. Not as her husband by contract, not as her employee, but as something else entirely. Neither of them slept that night, but not because of the storm, because something between them had changed, and there was no going back. The grand ballroom of the luxurious hotel shimmered with golden lights, casting an elegant glow over the sea of well-dressed elites mingling over expensive champagne and polished conversations. Ava moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her tailored black gown hugging her figure in all the right places. She exuded confidence, poised, untouchable, and every bit the powerful CEO she had worked so hard to become. Yet despite her composed exterior, Lucas could see the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around the stem of her champagne glass. He had learned to read her in the past few months, and something about tonight unsettled her. And then he saw why. Standing too close to her was a man Lucas immediately disliked. Dressed in an expensive suit, he had the kind of self-assured smirk that belonged to someone who thought the world revolved around him. His hand reached toward Ava, his fingers dangerously close to grazing hers. She didn't pull away immediately, but her lips pressed into a firm line, her body language screaming discomfort. Lucas didn't need to be told who this was. He had heard whispers of Ava's past, the ex-fiancée who had once broken her heart, who had chosen another woman when Ava had refused to be his submissive little trophy wife. And now, here he was, acting as if he still had a claim on her. "She looks stunning tonight, doesn't she?" the man mused, his voice smooth with arrogance. "Ava, you always did have an untouchable air, but we both know you deserve a real husband. Not whatever this arrangement is." His gaze flickered toward Lucas dismissively, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Lucas didn't think. He acted. In one swift motion, he closed the distance between them, his hands slipping around Ava's waist possessively. He could feel the slight jolt in her body, the way her breath caught in surprise as he pulled her against him. His grip was firm, but not forceful, protective, claiming. "She's already taken," Lucas said, his voice dangerously low, each word laced with a territorial edge he hadn't even known he possessed. The air around them thickened instantly, tension crackling like a live wire. Ava's ex-fiancé blinked, clearly taken aback. He hadn't expected a challenge, especially not from a man he saw as beneath him. "Interesting," he mused, his lips curling into a smirk. "I didn't think Ava would settle for someone so ordinary." Lucas's jaw tightened. He didn't care about wealth or social status, but the sheer audacity of this man made his blood boil. "The only thing Ava has settled for tonight," Lucas said smoothly, his voice deceptively calm, "is the fact that she's wasted even a second of her time entertaining this conversation." Ava, to Lucas's surprise, didn't correct him. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself lean into him, her warmth pressing against his side. Whether it was a silent agreement or an unspoken need to push back against the man who had once hurt her, Lucas didn't know. But it didn't matter. The ex-fiancé let out a low chuckle, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Well, well, I suppose I should back off. But remember, Ava, if you ever want more than just a placeholder husband—" His words trailed off suggestively, his smirk deepening before he finally walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Lucas could feel Ava's breath against his neck, shallow and uneven. His hand was still on her waist, his thumb unconsciously tracing slow circles through the fabric of her gown. The realization of what he had just done, what he had felt, hit him like a freight train. Jealousy. He had been jealous. Fiercely, irrationally jealous. And the worst part? He didn't regret it. The rest of the event passed in a blur. Ava remained close to him, whether by choice or necessity he wasn't sure. But Lucas was hyper-aware of her, the scent of her perfume, the occasional brush of her fingers against his, the warmth of her presence beside him. And yet neither of them spoke of what had happened, not until they were alone. The car ride home was thick with silence, heavier than the storm that had raged days ago. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he didn't know how to process. Ava sat beside him, her posture unnaturally stiff, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she was afraid of the answer. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenching. He could lie. He could brush it off, say it was just instinct, that he was only protecting her reputation. But none of that would be true, because the truth was far more dangerous, because you're mine now, because the thought of any other man touching you makes me want to break something, because I want you in ways I have no right to. But he couldn't say any of that. Not yet. So instead, he exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Because he disrespected you," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, "and I don't like it when people do that." Ava didn't respond immediately, but when he risked a glance at her, he found her watching him, her expression unreadable. For the rest of the ride, neither of them spoke another word. But the air between them told a different story, one filled with unspoken truths, unsaid desires, and a fire that was only just beginning to burn. The evening was quiet, the soft hum of the city blending with the gentle sizzling of vegetables in the pan as Ava stood by the stove, carefully stirring the sauce she'd been preparing. Cooking had always been a therapeutic escape for her, a rare moment of normalcy in a life filled with relentless board meetings, financial reports, and the constant pressure of running an empire. But tonight felt different. There was an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, a restlessness she couldn't quite shake. She had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, negotiating contracts and making high-stakes decisions that left her exhausted. And yet, despite the weight of her responsibilities, there was a strange sense of anticipation lingering in the air, something she couldn't define. She told herself it was just another evening, just another night in their strange arranged marriage. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Just as she reached for the seasoning, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She turned instinctively, only to find herself staring at Lucas as he walked into the kitchen, shirtless. Her heart did something odd, a quick, unexpected stutter as she took in the sight before her. His toned chest glistening slightly from his post-workout sweat, the way his muscles flexed as he ran a hand through his damp hair. He was casual, effortless, completely unaware of the way her pulse suddenly raced. He smirked, catching her staring. "Like what you see?" he teased, his voice low and playful, his green eyes twinkling with mischief. Ava immediately snapped out of it, rolling her eyes as she turned back to the stove. "You wish," she muttered, but the warmth creeping up her neck betrayed her. Lucas chuckled, leaning against the kitchen island. "You're a terrible liar, Ava." She huffed, trying to focus on her cooking, but her hands were suddenly unsteady. Why was she flustered? He was her husband, at least on paper. She had never been the type to swoon over a man, and yet here she was, feeling like a foolish schoolgirl, just because he had walked in half-dressed. In her haste to regain control of the situation, she moved too quickly, reaching for the sauce without looking. The next thing she knew, warm liquid spilled down the front of her dress, staining the fabric a deep red. "Damn it," she hissed, stepping back. Before she could grab a napkin, Lucas was already in front of her, his movements swift and effortless. He took a clean cloth from the counter, his fingers brushing against her waist as he gently dabbed at the stain. His touch was light, careful, and yet it sent an electric current through her entire body. Ava froze. The space between them had disappeared, and suddenly she was acutely aware of how close they were. His scent, warm, masculine, laced with the faintest hint of sweat, wrapped around her, intoxicating and distracting. She looked up, intending to thank him, but the words never came. Their eyes locked, time slowed, the air between them thickening with something unspoken, something undeniable. Lucas's hand lingered a second too long, his fingers barely grazing her skin. His gaze darkened, his playful smirk fading into something deeper, more intense. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Then, without warning, he leaned in. His lips met hers in a slow, deliberate kiss, one that stole the breath from her lungs. Ava stiffened at first, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. But then she melted. It was different from anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, nor was it fueled by duty or obligation. It was real. It was raw. It was the kind of kiss that stripped away all pretenses, leaving only the undeniable truth between them. Lucas's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she didn't resist. Instead, she reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair as she deepened the kiss, letting herself get lost in the moment. She had told herself this marriage was nothing more than a deal, that Lucas was just a name on a contract, a temporary presence in her life. But now, with his lips on hers, with the way he held her like she was the only thing that mattered, she realized how wrong she had been. The heat between them grew, the kiss turning more urgent, more desperate, as if they had both been waiting for this moment longer than they cared to admit. Lucas groaned softly against her mouth, his grip tightening, his hands sliding up her back, pressing her flush against him, and God, she wanted more. But then, as if reality had finally caught up to them, Lucas suddenly pulled back, his breathing ragged. Ava blinked, her own breath uneven, her lips still tingling from the intensity of what had just happened. For a long moment they just stared at each other. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something heavy, something unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. Lucas exhaled sharply, his hands still resting on her waist. "Ava," he started, but he didn't seem to know how to finish the sentence. Ava swallowed hard, her mind racing. She should say something, set boundaries, remind them both that this was just an arrangement. But she couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to. Instead, she whispered the only truth she could admit to herself in that moment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lucas's jaw clenched, his hands flexing against her waist before he slowly, reluctantly let go. "I know," he murmured. But the way he looked at her said otherwise, because deep down, they both knew the truth. It had already happened. And there was no turning back. Ava had always prided herself on being in control of her emotions. As the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies, she had spent years mastering the art of maintaining a composed, professional demeanor, never allowing emotions to cloud her judgment. Love, relationships, and attachments had no place in her carefully structured life. But now, sitting across from Lucas at the dining table, pretending everything was normal, she realized that she had lost control of the one thing she had always guarded, her heart. It had started slowly, almost unnoticeably, like a whisper in the back of her mind. The way he pulled out her chair before she sat, the way he made her coffee exactly how she liked it without ever being asked, the way his gaze softened when he looked at her as if she were the most important thing in his world. Those little moments had begun to chip away at the walls she had built around herself, and now, no matter how much she tried to deny it, there was no escaping the truth. She was falling in love with Lucas Hayes, her husband in name only, the man who was never meant to be anything more than a contract-bound partner. The realization sent a wave of panic through her, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the food on her plate rather than the man sitting across from her. But even that was impossible. Every movement he made, every glance he stole at her, every quiet breath he took felt magnified in the suffocating silence between them. She wondered if he felt it too. This unbearable tension that had settled between them, thick and heavy like an unspoken confession, lingering just at the tip of their tongues. Did he notice the way her breath hitched whenever he came too close? Did he see the way her fingers trembled slightly whenever he brushed against her, or was it all in her head?